So I have a fantastic panel here, and they're going to keep us with the harm for the moment. I'm going to ask them to, in their worlds, to describe what they're seeing and what they're hearing. And then we will move into some of the solutions that might be pertinent at this time from their perspective, and then I'll go to the floor. I was very struck this morning when I was listening to everybody, and I think the staff from Knowling in particular has resonated with me and stayed with me. The 10 cases every second, and they're really horrific crimes that we're talking about. So that has very much stayed with me. And then the various panelists talking about the pace of potentially child grooming, child sexual abuse, cyberbullying, just the pace that's happening. So I'm going to introduce you to my panel who are going to talk to us, as I said, a little bit more about what they're seeing and hearing, and then we'll move to some of the solutions. So I'll introduce them first, and they're probably all known to you for the fantastic work that they're doing, but Alex Cooney is the founder and chief executive of CyberSafeKids, and as you know, they've been working with thousands of children each year for the past decade in relation to online safety. They really advocate that each child is given the ability to be smart and safe online. They're really aware of what the issues are, but they're also very much part of the solution. Julie Brown, I've also had the pleasure of working with, and she's the clinical director of 1 in 4. Many of you will know it, an organisation that has a listening ear for adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Julie manages the fantastic team of therapists there, delivering an individual and group therapy to survivors of child sexual abuse, perpetrators of child sexual abuse, and the families of both. I had the pleasure of working with Julie in 1 in 4, and what they challenged me most about, which was a challenge that was presented this morning, is that we have to work with perpetrators, that perpetrators and victims are often the same, and that the age is decreasing all the time. So delighted to have Julie here. Ruth Breslin is the director of the Sexual Exploitation Research Policy Institute. This institute has become internationally recognised in its ability to provide, as a centre of excellence, but its ability to provide really quality testimony and evidence to what's happening, the harm in the commercial sex trade in Ireland and beyond. And Ruth is the director there, but also has led out on many pieces of groundbreaking research that have really challenged our thinking and made us reflect on what we might do. And last but not least, Siobhán O'Donoghue is the founding director of Uplift. She's a community worker, a social justice activist. Siobhán and myself have been around the block for many years, and her experience includes youth work, migrants' rights, national advocacy. She's been involved in many, many change movements, and that vast and diverse perspective, I think, is really pertinent today, and she brings a unique perspective from Uplift and that ability for coordinated action in relation to progressive change. So I'm going to start and ask all of you, just in the context of the panel, what you're seeing in your world and what we should be paying attention to. And Alex, I'm going to start with you. You have a...
Hello, is that good? Yep. Yeah. So what we're seeing, we're seeing incredible levels of access from young children. So we talk to children from 8 up, and we also gather trends and usage data. So we have a really good sense of kind of what they're doing online and the levels of access that they have. And it really is high, even in the young 8 to 12-year-old categories. We see very high numbers of underage usage of social media platforms, very high numbers of boys, young boys in particular, playing things like over 18s games. We see about a quarter of children in the younger age category being exposed to things like cyberbullying, being bothered by content online. And this is also a problem at secondary school level. So in fact, more children are being bullied. So we saw 38% of children in secondary school experiencing bullying and also being exposed to bothersome content, which is defined as kind of something that made you feel uncomfortable or scared or something you wish you hadn't seen. And this year we're getting a bit more insight into what kinds of content that is, that's coming up for them. So horror, torture, sexual content. I mean, you can imagine, we all know how accessible all of this content is. And probably the other thing that I would like to highlight is the levels of unsupervised access that children have, even those younger children. And in fact, there's a big step back in terms of oversight as children go into secondary school. So we see a lot of children saying that there's no rules, for example, around the use of devices in bedrooms. 82% of children across the spectrum told us that. So, it really, a child with any device that can connect to the internet, alone in a bedroom with a door shut, is vulnerable. So we will really encourage, obviously, parents to engage as much as possible in what their children are doing and show an interest, have that curiosity. But we're seeing that parents feel really on the back foot on this one.
Thanks, Alex. And can I ask you, when you're working with children and kind of playing testimony to what's happening for them, what do they think about the exposure for them?
Well, I was listening with real interest to the youth panel this morning, and I think, one of the messages that they had was they don't want to be banned from the online world, and I think we have to listen to that. I think that I also noticed that older young people kind of have different views about the levels of access their younger siblings and peers should have. So I think we do need to think about age and stage appropriate access. There's a lot of enjoyment that they get from it, and I think that came up on the panel this morning as well, and we have to recognize it. And we do believe that children have a right to participate in the online world. It's just that the way the online world is set up does not afford them the protections and safeguards that they should be afforded. They don't want to be scammed. They don't want to meet dodgy people online. There's a lot of things they don't like about it. But I would say the desire to be in it and be part of the conversation is stronger, for sure, than the desire to step back from it.
And in that context, how do we support them? How do we educate them? How do we help them navigate that world? And what are the gaps that are out there now?
I think it came up a couple of times this morning, this idea that we need a whole of society approach, right? There is no one silver bullet. But in order to better protect children online, we're going to need parents to feel more confident to take on that parenting role, parenting their children online. We're going to need a stronger focus on education. Children are growing up in a digital and technological age. They need to be equipped for it. We often refer to the likes of Finland that have embedded digital media literacy across the curriculum with this focus of upskilling, all children. And I think we need a much stronger focus on that within our education system. And I think we also, and it's difficult because we do now have new laws, both at the national level and the European level. So there's an element, and certainly this is what we're hearing, we have to wait and see kind of how that plays out and how the extent to which that offers better protection to children. But of course, we're impatient for that change to come about because we want children to thrive in the digital world, much as they do offline. So I think we need to really scrutinize how much difference these forms of legislation are making in terms of, and focus more on prevention rather than after the harm. And that's my concern. A lot of the legislation is focused on after the fact. Once the harm has happened, you have an obligation to remove it, or once you've been notified of it. But what about stopping it happening in the first place?
Absolutely, prevention being key. Ruth, I'm going to move on to you, I suppose. Just some initial observations about what's happening in your world.
So we are working on the issue of sexual exploitation in the context of prostitution, in the context of sex trafficking, and also in the context of pornography. A lot of our work is focused on the sexual exploitation of adult women, but increasingly, based on everything you're hearing today, you won't be surprised to hear we're also looking now more at the impacts and experiences of children and young people in this space as well. So I suppose what we're really struck by in terms of the international evidence is that it's becoming harder and harder to find a case of sexual exploitation that does not involve technology, where technology has not facilitated the process in some way. So if you don't mind, in terms of drawing on the international evidence, I'm going to share a kind of a case study with you that demonstrates this. So imagine a vulnerable teenage girl contacted by a predator on her Instagram who has spotted the vulnerability in the content of her posts. The grooming starts there and may then revert to a private messaging app, often WhatsApp or similar. The girl is offered an opportunity she cannot refuse, and she may even believe this man has fallen in love with her and they're going to be together. He uses a money transfer app to send her funds so she can travel to be with him. She arrives at his location and is photographed almost immediately and advertised online. Little does she know that she will see her first sex buyer within a matter of hours. She is, of course, advertised online as an independent escort who is over 18, creating the illusion of freedom and consent, but it is merely an illusion. From then on, her phone is used by the pimp to track and control her. He threatens to share her profile on the advertising website with her family members. Sometimes she is filmed with sex buyers. The pimp sets up an account on a camming website where her filmed abuse is shared and sometimes live streamed. The content eventually ends up on Pornhub. Meanwhile, the money made by her pimp is moved and laundered online via banking apps and the use of cryptocurrency. Even when she eventually escapes from his control, the recordings of her being violated remain online, perhaps forever. So the point here is this is a fictionalized case, but it's drawing on evidence of so many cases we and colleagues around the world have gathered. And it really reflects the evidence that's emerging from the sex trade, but also that victims and survivors, and especially younger victims and survivors, are telling us themselves, is that technology has been used at all these stages to identify them in the first place, to target them, to groom them and recruit them, to arrange their travel and logistics, to control them, advertise them, and to generate pornography, their abuse, and then launder the profits online. So there's, I think there's an awful lot of the online world and online services that are implicated there in this very clear case of sexual exploitation.
Thanks, Ruth. That's a pretty horrific case, but I think it really clarifies the connection between technology and the harm online. So you've done lots of research, really good quality research on the commercial sex trade. What does the market tell us about child sexual abuse, and how does it play out there?
I think, yeah, that is a really good question. So one thing that we really need to understand is that youth is highly in demand and highly eroticized in the sex trade. So we have a situation in Ireland where every day very young women are advertised online for the purposes of prostitution. We are not entirely comfortable that they are all over 18. And youth is really eroticized in the way that those young women are advertised. So some of the evidence we've gathered shows that, young women are advertised in a way that's very childlike. They have lollipops and teddy bears. They're in school uniforms and they're holding school books. And this is on the main prostitution advertising website right now. They're described in their profile as petite and slender. They say they're friendly, young and cute. I can be your small little sweetheart. This is the way they're being advertised to buyers. I have a cute face. I'm playful. I'm a delicate, cute girl. There's, those profiles can be found online right now. But we also see this in pornography. So the most popular genre right now in pornography is teen or teenager. That is greatly in demand. The girls that are being portrayed in these videos, again, are often being portrayed in this very childlike way. So I suppose one of the things I want us to kind of consider today is demand. Where is this demand? We're talking a lot about child sexual abuse material today. Where is the demand for this coming from? And I think it's really important that we look more closely at the escalation pathways. So there's some really excellent evidence now coming from the front line. Child sexual abuse material is not just created in order to be launched into a vacuum. There is a demand for it. There's a demand for this kind of imagery to be bought, shared, traded, sold in different ways. Where is that coming from? There are a lot of men now coming forward who are demonstrating problematic use of pornography, who don't intend in the first instance to consume content featuring children, but that's where they end up. And the pornography platforms, and I'm talking about the mainstream ones such as Pornhub, are pulling some users, some men, down that kind of rabbit hole through those escalation pathways. So we're increasingly now seeing men who said, I never intended to consume content featuring children, but I got interested in teen porn. And teen porn is that bridge into then essentially consuming child abuse material. And the algorithms on those platforms are very much pushing these men down those rabbit holes. And this is something that the porn platforms have entirely refused to, kind of accept responsibility for. But it's clear that the algorithms are working in that way. The platforms are all about keeping users engaged and keeping them on the platform as long as possible in order to maximize advertising revenue. It operates just like Pornhub and the likes operate just like YouTube. And I think the problem here is that men were saying that they were watching videos that then started to bore them. They weren't getting the same dopamine hit. They weren't getting the same enjoyment. And they started going down these slippery slopes to more extreme content, and it led them to consuming child abuse material. So I think we need to look at the wider role of the sex trade and the pornography trade in particular in creating this massive demand for child abuse material.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. This morning we were talking about solutions and things that might work. And there's always that balance, isn't there, between regulation and collaboration. So one of the examples was around collaborating with Pornhub, which I had a reaction to. So you have a lot more expertise than I. Can you just comment on that?
Sure. So I had a reaction to that as well, because Pornhub has done nothing to demonstrate that it doesn't want children on its platform. It states that all the time in its publicity. It states, of course, we don't want anyone under 18 to visit our platform. And yet it has no problem featuring Paw Patrol-themed porn, or Pokemon-themed porn, or Minecraft-themed porn. Every year it writes a blog that talks about the most popular gaming categories of porn on the site. And it is all games that are beloved by young children, There's nothing that sites like that have done to demonstrate that they don't want children there. So I think the example was given as Pornhub teaming up with Internet Watch Foundation and Lucy Faithfull Foundation in the UK. That's hugely beneficial to Pornhub. It gives them a lot of credibility. I think that, sites like that are essentially a part of, a massive global sex trade and are making huge money from it, I don't think that they can be trusted to be part of the conversation in this way. But that's not to say that the bigger tech companies shouldn't be part of the conversation. I think they should. Look, people were talking this morning about a bot that's been designed by predators to begin the grooming process with young people. Well, if we can design a bot to groom children, then we can design a bot to detect grooming. I'm sure that the technology exists to combat so many of these things. It's just that we're lacking the political will, and the big tech companies are lacking the will because this affects their bottom line, it affects their profit. So I think it's very clear from this morning, self-regulation is not working. A few years ago, WhatsApp threatened to pull out of the whole of the UK market because there was a fear about end-to-end encryption. It's very clear that child sexual abuse material and child sexual exploitation has been shared via the end-to-end encryption on WhatsApp. They put privacy above the safety of children and threatened to pull out of the UK market. We cannot leave it to them. So this is about governments and civil society standing up to these big tech giants.
Great, thanks, Ruth. And I'll come back to solutions in a little while. Julie, moving into the therapeutic world, can you tell us about what you're hearing and what you're working with?
Yes, I would say that obviously I think there's an added layer of complexity when you add technology into child sexual abuse. So I work with adults, and everybody's different, but normally when you start working with somebody who has probably complex trauma, maybe complex PTSD, you're initially working on the nervous system and all of those kinds of, all the PTSD symptoms, the flashbacks, all of that. But really over time what therapy is doing is it's kind of putting a narrative in place where something has happened however long ago, it's happened in the past, but the key thing about a narrative is it has a beginning, a middle and an end. But when their abuse has been filmed or they know a video of it exists, it's very, very difficult to have a narrative, to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The other thing is I think that there's always a grooming process in child sexual abuse, and people tend to associate almost the hand that harms as the perpetrator's hand. And I think on a lot of abuse imagery, sometimes it's children on their own or children with other children. And that creates a huge layer of complexity, and children are manipulated and coerced essentially to touch themselves. And therefore it's like the hand that is touched is their own, and just the psychological impact of that. So I picked it's a study, and it interviewed men who were convicted and imprisoned for producing child abuse imagery. And one of them, Ryan, he abused his stepdaughter from the age of 6 to 9. And he encouraged her to, and the reason this case was particularly notable was that the imagery was of particularly kind of sadistic nature. So he encouraged her to choose a stage name herself, and consulted with her about the scenes that they would create together. And then there was another man, Edward, and he abused his stepdaughter from the age of 6 to 8, and he encouraged her to view images with him and view videos with him, and then they would decide together on the scenes that they would create. So the harm to the bodies of those young girls would be obviously readily apparent to anybody who had the misfortune to have to view the imagery. But if you think about the level of psychic intrusion and how to kind of unwrap all of that, and that's why I think one of the speakers earlier spoke about the 44% anxiety disorders, the over 200% schizophrenia, the 98% more likely to self-harm. That is the real impact, and I think often as well survivors can, obviously with great difficulty, but sometimes they can describe the first kind of sexual act that happens. That's not where it starts for the person who perpetrates. It starts way back in the narrative. And by the time often people perpetrate, they have a lot of control over that child. And, there is no child abuse imagery without a child. And people think it's online. There are no online children. There are only children. So,
thanks, Julie. And you touched on it there. I'm just going to ask you to expand on it a little bit. So when, kids know that the existence of that online child abuse, just the trauma that causes when they know it's circulating. And
it's like being re-victimized again and again and again, and that's the thing, there's no end. And if you think about it, like, obviously we work with people who've perpetrated as well, and I think it's actually quite valuable to work with both, because you don't. I think it's important to have both sides of the kind of, because it is a system. People are abused in a system, and often, like for people who perpetrate, they're worried about being in the newspaper, for example. And this is a huge fear for them, and being kind of exposed. And we would usually often say in groups, well, that may have consequences for you, but they're an adult. They know why they're there. They're fully clothed. If they are photographed, they're fully clothed in a context that they can understand. Whereas you imagine a child who's abused online, they go into a coffee shop, they go to school, they get on a bus, they miss the train. Anybody, any single person that they can meet in their life day to day may have seen them at the most horrific moments of their life. So I think it's really important I think sometimes the online context can almost be minimized, and a big question around risk is, will this lead, is this a doorway, will this lead to contact offending? And that is an important question, and risk assessment is really important, but it's not the only question. There is massive, massive harm, and as there are no online children, there are only real children.
Great, thanks, Julie. Siobhán, I'm going to move to you and into the community. So Uplift's People's Inquiry on Big Tech Harms, that highlighted obviously a lot of concerns around online safety. What's happening in your world, and what did that tell you?
So just before we launched the People's Inquiry on Big Tech Harms, we did a big community-wide survey around kind of this time last year, and we collected over 1,000 experiences and stories of people's what it's like stories of concern. And I just thought it might be useful to share some of the trends that, some of the patterns we pulled out of that we could kind of group them under. And the first one was around kind of the impact of misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories. And the stories people were talking about was how they're families falling apart, friendships falling apart, kids falling out with their older relatives, because they're, it's actually older people who are more inclined to actually get pulled in by conspiracy theories than younger people, actually. But just the pain of that, and particularly in relation to health-based disinformation, but also the kind of manipulative content that is happening, particularly around, say, if there's an issue like, a protest against people seeking asylum in a local area. So that was a big trend. Another one was just the scale of weight loss and mental health content that's been directed at young people was huge. I mean, that's a whole category of itself. It was one of the 5 things we pulled out. And then kind of linked to that, but separate because it was much bigger again, was what's happening around targeted advertising. So, what we are seeing is that, these corporations are literally deciding what you see based on, the shape of your face, your age, where you've been, your gender, and also, or what issues, what you're experiencing in your life, and they're targeting content, and that was like, particularly parents were really, really like, struggling with this, and then the fourth area was the impact of harmful content, particularly a lot around YouTube and the way in which, kids start off watching a funny film or program on YouTube, and suddenly they're being targeted with the most gross kind of vile content that is actually really causing them huge angst. So and that kind of led then to the People's Inquiry, where we pulled all of this together. Nolene was the chair of our big day in November, and we were able to kind of connect everything from climate change to the impact of democracy, mental health, and Alex, you were involved as well, with particularly around health-based information online. So I suppose it's hard to see, there's no one thing, but I suppose in general, one of the big conclusions is that the problems are well rehearsed, the solutions are well known. It's really clear that the push towards kind of individualizing our experience, like all those stories we gathered, for example, are all individual stories that people, are struggling with in their everyday lives. But when you collectivize it and you realize that the solution really isn't maybe banning phones in schools, for example. The solution is in the way the algorithms and the recommender systems and the surveillance advertising and, the way, the way that system is being organized, which is basically a systemic solution as opposed to an individual, responsibility solution. And what was very clear, I think, as well, is that people are very, very cynical about big tech's capacity to self-regulate. It's a bit like asking the fox to mind the hen house, and that they don't expect corporations to have their interests at heart, but we do expect our politicians and our political leaders to act in our common good and to protect us, and that's unfortunately failing as well. Successive governments have literally sat on their hands and let big tech corporations free rein, and we're considered the laggards of Europe when it comes to the enforcement of particularly around GDPR and data protection.
Thanks, Siobhán, and you've moved us nicely into solutions, actually. So I'm going to stay with you just for one or two questions. So you've been involved in shifting public perception and action for a long time. In this context, what should we be doing? I mean, you're saying it's well-versed. Is it? And if it is, what should we be doing?
Well, so one of the things that we're doing at the moment is we've a collective, like we heard about the Commission of Man, the Digital Services Act is actually really good. But it's largely untested. I mean, it could be better, let's be clear about it, but it's good enough, right, in terms of where it could bring us. But it's only at the early stages of enforcement, and Commission Man's role is actually very important, but that's just getting off the ground. So what we're doing, and I think it's what we need more of, is the idea of kind of collective complaints. So we've just done that in the last few months. We've basically gathered, we went back to a lot of those people actually and said, okay, are you willing to make a complaint under the Digital Services Act? And we've done that now. And what that is showing is existing failures already. So for example, on Facebook, when people think they're making a complaint or reporting something, that's not actually compliant with the Digital Services Act. It doesn't work. So we're exposing these kind of gaps in the system. We've heard about the trusted flagger system. Actually, to become a trusted flagger is it's just impossible. It's impossible. So I think what we can do, I suppose I'm saying in terms of solutions and what the actual steps we can take, we can expose those gaps and those weaknesses and shout like from the rooftops. The other thing we can do, and one of the initiatives that Uplift really had to coordinate over the last few years was called Turn Off the Hate Megaphone. Yeah. So we were kind of very involved in the establishment of the Hope and Courage Collective, countering kind of the whole kind of rise of far right. So when there's a massive incident happening, whether that's a riot in Dublin or whatever it is, or people, LGBTQ plus people being targeted in a local area or whatever, it's helping people make sense of that in a way that puts the spotlight right back on the road, the systemic problem, as opposed to, a kind of, if we were all just nicer to each other, we'd be all right. And putting the attention back on the platforms in particular, and governments, our expectations that they hold them accountable. So there are just a few of the things that we can do.
Great, thanks a million. Julie, just in terms of your own context as well, if you had a magic wand and you could do one or two things, what would you prioritise?
So I suppose, having worked in sexual violence for more than 20 years, I think prevention is immeasurably better than cure. So the kind of prevention we do in 1 in 4 is technically tertiary prevention. It's working with people who have been caught offending to ensure they don't go on and re-offend and hurt more children. But obviously, prevention before the harm happens is far, far better. And I think the harm is so great that people are often kind of naturally want to take a step back from this aspect. It's not appealing. But what I would say is, like, we work with people from 18 to 80 on a prevention programme, and any of the younger men, and by that I mean probably men up to the age of 25, without exception, they all started offending in their teens. Following that trajectory, I'd agree wholeheartedly with the trajectory of pornography use to compulsive pornography use to increasing paraphilic themes to CSAM. Child sexual exploitation material is just but it's the same as CSAM. So I think what we really need is a much more kind of system-wide, society-wide awareness of that people can get help at an earlier stage, advertised. There is, people in Ireland can contact the Lucy Faithfull helpline. I don't know if anybody knows that. I've never seen an ad for it. But if people are worried about their thoughts about children, they can contact a helpline. So I said prevention. And the other thing I'd like to just say around harm, and they're often forgotten, after the victims and the victims' families themselves, the people who are most impacted by people who perpetrate are their families. Often the first time a mother knows that her son has sexually offended is when the guards come to the house, or a wife who's maybe married for 20 years. Most people who perpetrate against children have children, and their world opens up. They literally, the bottom falls out of their world. They have not done anything wrong. They're essentially secondary victims in this, and society does not afford them any compassion or sympathy. If they feel lucky if they don't actually get targeted and their house doesn't get kind of spray painted. So I think that stigma really militates against child protection, and I think we have to have, I understand the anger. Does the anger protect children? Probably not. I think.
Thanks, Julie. Ruth.
Thanks, Denise.
Your magic wand.
Yeah,
what are the one or two things you'd like us to prioritise?
So I think in our most recent research on pornography and its impacts, and we were making the broader links between pornography consumption and the perpetration of violence against women and girls, I think all the experts that we spoke to for that study had a consensus, really agreed on one thing, which is that much of what pornography is nowadays is sexually violent content, and that content is shaping our sexual scripts, those of adults and those of young people. And therefore, at the very least, children and young people under 18 should not be day-to-day exposed to this kind of content. So this is where we get into discussions about age verification. And that's a complex thing. And no, it isn't a silver bullet, but at least let's reduce children's accessibility, easy access right now to this content, at least trying to reduce that. And then this is for the benefit of future generations, because we're preventing more young people, children, from drawn into this content, and in some cases developing kind of compulsive behaviour around it and going down those escalation pathways, going down those rabbit holes to offending themselves. So I think it's really about reducing young people's access to this content. And as I kind of referred to earlier, also using technology, using good tech to fight this perhaps more nefarious tech. I think we need some tech bros on board with us in this fight. And yeah, generally, as I said, the political will, there's lots of work we're all doing in civil society, but we really need to come around this together and, beat it together.
Great, thanks.
Thanks. I mean, a lot has been said already. I wholeheartedly agree that prevention is better than cure, and I worry that a lot of the legislation that we have is more focused on addressing the harm after the fact. So I'd like to see more on the prevention side, and yeah, age blocking access to clearly adult content would be one such measure that we need to put in place urgently, really. And then you get onto the kind of harmful stuff and the age gates around that. I mean, the ideal is an internet that is safe by design, private by default. I think a lot of these tech companies hide behind the fact that they're, this causal evidence. There isn't this evidence of a causal link between, the consumption of their products and harm. So, they don't have that kind of spur to action. So I do think we need to build the evidence base to prove the harm. The more evidence we have, the harder it will be for them to hide behind these reasons. And I think we need, much clearer standards in place that they have to achieve. So that self-regulation is truly over. It is, that they are being told what the standard is, and they must reach that standard rather than them determining it. And of course, education of children and young people is really important. There's loads of great initiatives happening across the board, but we need to make sure that we're getting to every child, that they're all getting that, really comprehensive digital literacy education, and we're supporting their parents as well, so that they're getting that support at home, so that they learn to navigate through these online spaces and avoid harm to the extent that they can.